Hi there, I'm just a little cat trying to reach my first 1,000 subscribers. It's free. Just click subscribe right under this video. It would mean the world to me.
Christmas dinner turned quiet when my dad said, "You should be grateful we still let you stay here." I looked at him, fork frozen in midair, and said, "Funny, I just took back ownership of the house an hour ago." His face went pale instantly. "What would you do if your own father acted like he was doing you a favor by keeping you in the house you were born in? And what if that house was actually yours all along? They say time heals all wounds, but that's a lie people tell themselves so they don't have to deal with the mess they've left behind. In reality, time doesn't heal anything. It just buries the pain under new distractions until the right moment rips everything open again. And for me, that moment came in the form of a stiff, overly formal email from my mother, sent on the second Monday of December at exactly 7:32 in the morning, as if she'd scheduled it to appear businesslike and polite. The message read, "Hi Emily, your father and I would like to invite you for Christmas dinner this year. We're hoping to have the whole family together. Let us know if you can make it. Love, Mom." There was no warmth in it, no sense of reaching out, just words she probably retyped 3 times until they sounded safe enough to press send. I stared at it for a full 5 minutes before responding with a single line. "I'll be there." I hadn't been to the house in over 5 years. Not since I packed up what little dignity I had left after my divorce and left their guest room behind, pretending it hadn't felt like a prison the entire time. My father, Greg, had made it his mission back then to remind me daily that I was living under his roof, like I was some failed investment he hadn't gotten the returns he wanted from. Every morning, he'd find a reason to bring it up. "You know, Em, most people your age are helping their parents out by now." Or worse, when my mother wasn't in the room, "You were supposed to be the smart one, remember? What the hell happened to you?" I'll be honest. There were days I almost believed him. I almost believed that I was the disappointment he saw when he looked at me across the breakfast table, unshowered and worn down by the legal battle with my ex, with barely enough left in me to keep my eyes open. He liked seeing me like that. I know that now. It made him feel stronger, like the man of the house again. And when I finally scraped together the courage to leave, to rebuild, I did it without telling them anything. Not about the consulting firm I joined 6 months later, not about how I built my own list of clients after a year, and certainly not about how I bought my own place in the city with no help from anyone. I let them think I was floating around aimless, barely making it. It served my purpose better that way. So when the invitation came, I didn't hesitate. I already knew I was going, not because I missed them, not because I wanted some kind of healing, Christmas movie-style reunion, but because I had unfinished business in that house, business that had been building for 2 decades, layered in silence, blame, and manipulation. The kind of business that doesn't get resolved with a hug in front of the fireplace. The week leading up to Christmas, I took care of the final paperwork. It had taken almost a year of digging, of quiet legal maneuvering, of tracking down original documents and verifying signatures. It was a long shot, but I had always suspected something was off about the way my grandmother's estate was handled after she passed. I'd been 19 at the time, still grieving, still living at home, while I figured out what college I could afford. She and I had been close, closer than anyone else in the family, and before she passed, she told me in her soft, whispery voice, "One day this house will be yours, Emily. I want you to have something that's truly yours." At the time, I thought she meant sentimentally, but I found her will, the real one, the one my father conveniently lost after her death. And now, on paper and in the court system, the house was mine. Legally, indisputably mine. The transfer finalized on the morning of December 24th. I opened the confirmation email while sipping burnt coffee at a gas station just outside of town. I read it twice, letting the weight of it settle in my chest like concrete. Then I smiled, wiped my mouth, and drove the last 40 minutes toward the house I'd grown up in. The house that had felt like both a womb and a coffin. Snow was falling by the time I pulled into the driveway, light enough to seem festive but cold enough to sting. The house looked exactly the same. Beige siding, plastic wreath on the door, same blue sedan parked crooked by the garage. Nothing had changed. But everything was different. My mother answered the door with that tight-lipped smile she always wore when she was anxious. "Emily, you made it. We weren't sure." Her voice trailed off as she looked past me, maybe half expecting I'd brought someone with me, maybe hoping I hadn't. I didn't hug her. I just stepped inside and nodded. "Of course I made it. It's home, isn't it?" Greg was in the living room, watching the news, with the volume way too loud. He didn't look up right away. When he did, it was like watching a poker player register a bad hand, but try to keep a straight face. "Well, look who finally decided to come back," he said. "Must have run out of things to complain about in the city." I could have snapped back. I could have said a dozen things that would have cut through him like a blade, but not yet. Instead, I just smiled and said, "It's good to see you too, Dad. The thing about revenge, if you want it to stick, is that you have to let it simmer. Let them stay comfortable just long enough to think they're still in control." Kyle arrived an hour later. My younger brother, still boyish despite being in his 30s, still living at home, still talking about starting a business once things settle down. He hugged me like nothing had happened, like time hadn't fractured our bond the way it had. I didn't blame him, really. He was just another product of the environment. We ate finger foods in the kitchen while Linda kept checking on the roast, and Greg paced around like he was waiting for a delivery. Small talk, fake smiles, memories polished up to seem fonder than they were. I played along, listening to them rewrite our family history, like it was a script they'd rehearsed for years. I let them, because by tomorrow night, the script would be mine. And when Greg finally sat down at the head of the table that evening and raised his glass to toast family and forgiveness, I could barely keep from laughing. Because what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the biggest gift of the evening was already unwrapped, already delivered. He just hadn't noticed yet. But he would. Very, very soon. The air inside the house had that strange, familiar stillness I remembered from my teenage years. A silence that wasn't the absence of sound but the presence of restraint, like everyone was holding their breath beneath layers of politeness. Each word weighed carefully, every sentence constructed to avoid confrontation yet dripping with suppressed judgment. The floorboards creaked in the same spots they always had, and the kitchen smelled like overcooked onions and dry stuffing, the kind of meal that tried to be festive but somehow always felt like a duty. My mother moved between the stove and the counter with that same anxious energy, her hands busy and her eyes darting, looking for something to focus on so she wouldn't have to settle into the tension already rising like steam in the room. Kyle sat at the table thumbing his phone like a teenager despite being nearly 34, occasionally grunting out half-laughs at whatever feed he was scrolling through, while my father, Greg, paced with the tight posture of a man who wanted to say something but couldn't decide whether it would come out as a joke or an order. They had no idea, no clue that I was sitting among them, not as the defeated daughter they remembered, but as the rightful owner of the house they lorded over me my entire life. Not as a visitor, not as a guest, and certainly not as someone grateful for their so-called generosity. No, I had already signed the papers, received the confirmation, and had everything filed through a lawyer with meticulous precision. The ownership of this house had officially transferred into my name that morning, and while it would take them time to truly grasp what that meant, I was already settling into the quiet satisfaction of knowing the truth, even as I kept it buried under my composed smile and polite nods. Dinner began like any other holiday meal in that house, awkwardly with forced enthusiasm and overly enthusiastic clinking of glasses meant to symbolize unity we hadn't felt in years. Greg sat at the head of the table as if nothing had changed, carving the roast with the same precision and smug confidence he had always used to divide the meat like he was apportioning respect. My mother served everyone in careful portions, always making sure Greg's plate was full first, as though maintaining his satisfaction was some unspoken rule that had to be observed lest the whole house unravel into chaos. Kyle talked about a crypto investment that wasn't a scam, despite what people say, and my mother tried to ask about my work without revealing that she didn't understand a single thing I did. I answered vaguely, offering just enough information to keep the illusion going because the truth wasn't ready to come out yet. Not until the moment was absolutely right. And then, somewhere between the mashed potatoes and the cranberry sauce, Greg cleared his throat in that deliberate way he always did when he wanted attention, without seeming like he was asking for it. He leaned back in his chair, dabbed at his mouth with a cloth napkin, and then, with the kind of smugness only he could deliver in a tone that sounded almost fatherly, said, "You know, Em, you should really be more grateful we still let you stay here when you needed it. Most people would have charged rent." He said it with a laugh, but there was no humor in it, only that sharp-edged judgment he always wrapped in fake concern. There was a moment of silence after that, the kind that follows a slap you didn't see coming. My mother froze mid-chew, Kyle stopped scrolling, and I set my fork down slowly, deliberately, because I wasn't going to let that comment hang in the air like smoke. I turned my head and looked him directly in the eyes. His gray-blue eyes that had once held authority over every room he entered, and said calmly, clearly, "Funny, I just took back ownership of the house an hour ago." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was absolute. Greg blinked once, twice, as though he hadn't heard me properly or was trying to parse the sentence in real time, like the words didn't make sense when strung together in that particular order. My mother's face went pale, the color draining so fast it looked like she'd suddenly aged 5 years. Kyle let out a confused, hollow chuckle and said, "What do you mean, took back?" Like it was a joke he wasn't in on yet. But it wasn't a joke. Not even close. I kept my tone level, almost cheerful, as I added, "The transfer finalized this morning. Grandma's original will was reinstated. The house is legally mine now, has been since around 10 o'clock. I just didn't want to ruin the stuffing." Greg stared at me like he was trying to recognize a stranger in a crowd, like he knew my face but didn't understand who was behind it anymore. For a man who'd always made a show of being in control, of being the final word in every conversation, this moment peeled him open with surgical precision. He didn't yell, not yet. He just stood up, his chair screeching across the floor, and left the room without a word, the way a dog slinks off when it's been caught chewing through something it shouldn't have touched. My mother looked at me with a mix of horror and something I couldn't quite name, fear maybe or guilt, and whispered, "Emily, what are you talking about? That can't be right. Your father—" She trailed off before she could finish the sentence. Probably because the part she wanted to say, "Your father took care of everything," sounded ridiculous now, hollow and unconvincing. I didn't respond. I just picked up my fork and started eating again. The stuffing was dry, the potatoes lumpy, and the roast overcooked. But somehow, it tasted better than anything I'd eaten in that house in 20 years. Across the table, Kyle kept glancing between me and the hallway where Greg had disappeared, like he didn't know which direction was safer to look. My mother quietly started collecting plates, her movements robotic, as though she thought that keeping busy would somehow undo what had just been said. But it was done. The house was mine. The truth was out. And the balance of power that had been carefully preserved in this family like a relic behind glass had just cracked straight down the middle. They just didn't know how deep that crack went yet. But they would, soon enough. The next morning brought with it the kind of brittle winter sunlight that slips through half-closed curtains but fails to warm anything it touches, illuminating the cold corners of old rooms and casting long, thin shadows over the cracked tile of the kitchen floor, as if the house itself were reluctant to acknowledge the shift in power that had occurred the night before. My father didn't come to breakfast. Not that I expected him to. After my little announcement at dinner, he'd retreated upstairs without another word, his footsteps heavy and deliberate on the staircase, each a thud a punctuation mark to a sentence he hadn't finished, and possibly never would. My mother moved through the kitchen in near silence, pouring coffee without looking up, as though her focus on the mundane ritual could somehow anchor her to the version of reality she still preferred. The one where she and Greg were still in control, where Emily was still a guest, Still grateful, still the girl who had to ask permission to exist within her own childhood home. But that version had expired, and every moment that passed was forcing her to catch up with a truth she hadn't wanted to see, let alone accept. I sat at the table, drinking the coffee she handed me without thanks, not out of cruelty, but because politeness now felt like a luxury reserved for equals, and I wasn't interested in making her feel comfortable when comfort had never been a courtesy extended to me. Kyle shuffled in, bleary-eyed and still in his sweatpants, mumbling something about the heat not working upstairs, clearly fishing for a reason to blame someone for his discomfort now that the tectonic plates beneath our family had shifted. I didn't engage him. There was no point. Whatever was coming next didn't involve him yet. He was still clinging to the idea that this whole thing was just a dramatic misunderstanding, that I'd made a mistake, or worse, a cruel joke I would walk back with a sheepish smile and a casual gotcha. But I wasn't laughing, and I wasn't explaining myself. Not yet. Instead, I took my coffee and slipped away into the hallway, letting the familiar creaks of the floorboards guide me toward the one part of the house that had always felt like a tomb, the basement. It was down there, below ground, past the old water heater and beneath the faded holiday decorations, where Greg kept the things no one was supposed to touch. There had been a cabinet down there for as long as I could remember, heavy and locked, made of warped oak with rusted hinges and a padlock so old it might have been original to the house itself. As kids, Kyle and I had once tried to jimmy it open with a butter knife, but Greg had caught us and flown into one of his rare, silent rages, the kind that didn't involve yelling, but something far more unnerving. The long, cold stares that told you you'd crossed a line you didn't know existed. Now standing in front of that cabinet as an adult, with the legal deed to the house in my name, I realized for the first time that I didn't need permission anymore. I didn't need to ask. I didn't need to wait. The lock was old, and the wood had swollen over the years from moisture and neglect, so it didn't take much effort. Just a firm tug with a flathead screwdriver I found hanging from a nail nearby. And the padlock gave way with a reluctant pop, the kind of sound that carries the weight of secrets finally, grudgingly surrendering. Inside the cabinet were layers of documents, some yellowed and curling at the edges, others neatly stacked in plastic sleeves, organized by someone who thought order could protect them from scrutiny. I pulled them out slowly, reading the names, dates, and signatures, feeling the shape of my childhood reassemble itself in ways I hadn't expected. There were letters, dozens of them, that I had written as a teenager, drafts of college applications, thank you notes to scholarship committees, correspondence that had clearly never been mailed. I recognized my handwriting instantly, messy but hopeful, every sentence brimming with a girl who still believed she could build a future with hard work and a little luck. But here they were, hidden away, never sent, never followed up on. I read the dates and realized these letters corresponded exactly with the time when I'd stopped receiving callbacks, when I thought no one had been interested in me or my applications. It hadn't been rejection, it had been sabotage. Greg had taken them, hidden them, stopped them from ever leaving the house. I found the envelope from the State Scholarship Board, sealed, never opened, and inside was a congratulatory letter. I had been selected. A full ride, tuition, room, and board. I stood there for what felt like hours, holding that letter, the edges soft with time, and felt something cold and sharp lodge itself deep in my chest. Not sadness, not even rage, but something more permanent. A confirmation that everything I had suspected, everything I had buried under the excuses I'd made for him, was real. He hadn't just been controlling, he had been deliberate. He hadn't believed in me, and worse, he hadn't wanted me to leave. I was easier to manage broken, easier to guilt trip when I failed, easier to control when I had no options. Then I saw it, the original will, my grandmother's name at the top, written in her familiar cursive, and beneath it, the line that changed everything. I leave the family home located at 1127 Buckner Lane to my granddaughter, Emily Jean Lawson, with the expectation that it be maintained as a place of her choosing, free of burden or claim from any other family member. I read it twice, then 3 times, as if expecting it to vanish or change, but it didn't. It was real. It had been here all along. There was another document notarized and dated 6 weeks later, listing Greg as the sole heir to the estate, a replacement will suspiciously convenient, and filed right after my grandmother's death, during a time when I had been too consumed by grief to ask questions. I knew then what I hadn't dared to say out loud until now. He had forged or manipulated something. The details weren't fully clear yet, but the intent was obvious. He had stolen the house. He had stolen my future. When I finally climbed back up the stairs and re-entered the kitchen, my mother was sitting silently at the table, nursing the same cup of coffee, staring out the window at the snow piling up on the porch. She didn't look at me. She didn't ask where I'd been. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers clutched the mug, as though it were the only solid thing in her world right now. I didn't say anything. I just laid the documents on the table in front of her, one by one, watching her eyes scan the pages. Her hands began to shake slightly. She opened her mouth once, then closed it again, as if she were struggling to locate the right script, and discovering for the first time that there wasn't one prepared for this moment. It wasn't the kind of confrontation people imagine. There was no shouting, no accusations screamed into the cold kitchen air, but the silence between us was heavier than any argument. It said more than words could have. And I knew, as I watched her look up at me, wide-eyed and trembling, that we had only just begun to scratch the surface. The real reckoning was still to come. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles in a house after a long-kept secret finally surfaces, the sort of oppressive, bone-deep stillness that doesn't resemble peace so much as a temporary ceasefire, in a war where neither side is ready to admit the extent of the damage. That was the atmosphere the following day, thick, breathless, and clinging to the walls like smoke after a fire that never quite went out. My father had not come downstairs since the dinner, and although the house was small enough that you could hear every floorboard creak from one end to the other, it was like he'd vanished into the drywall, leaving only his presence behind, looming and heavy and souring the air. My mother, meanwhile, moved through the rooms like a ghost, avoiding eye contact, her movements careful, almost reverent, as if she were walking on the grave of her own denial, too afraid to look directly at the truth, but too aware now to pretend it wasn't staring back at her. I spent the morning in the den, flipping through old family photo albums, not out of nostalgia, but because I wanted to remind myself what it looked like, the great myth of our normal family, carefully staged and curated for Christmas cards and Facebook posts. There we were, matching sweaters, forced smiles, my father's hand always resting just a little too firmly on someone's shoulder, the kind of possessive touch you don't notice until you look back with eyes that have finally learned to see. It wasn't grief that struck me as I turned the pages. It was clarity, the sudden and jarring understanding that everything I thought had been broken slowly over time had, in fact, been cracked from the beginning, and we had all been trained to ignore the sound. By noon, I found myself back in the kitchen, not really hungry, but restless, the kind of agitation that seeps in when you know something is coming but can't quite predict from which direction. My mother was at the sink, scrubbing a glass she'd already cleaned twice, and I watched her in silence for a while before I finally spoke, my voice low but unflinching. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, not accusing, not emotional, just direct, the way a surgeon might ask a nurse for the next instrument, because there was no point in dressing it up anymore. She didn't look at me right away. Instead, she kept scrubbing, her knuckles pale, her eyes fixed on a spot somewhere beyond the window. When she finally responded, her voice was thin, brittle, like paper about to tear. "Your father said you weren't ready." It was such a neat sentence, so practiced, so perfectly hollow, that for a moment I thought she might actually believe it. But I saw the way her jaw tensed when she said it, the flicker of something between shame and exhaustion in her eyes, and I knew the truth. She had known. Maybe not everything, maybe not the full depth of the deception, but enough to understand that silence wasn't just complicity, It was survival. Not ready, I echoed, laughing quietly, the sound sharp and joyless. I was 19. I had a scholarship. I had a plan. I was the only one in the family who actually had a goddamn direction, and he stole that from me. She flinched at the word stole, but she didn't deny it, which was worse than if she had. Her silence confirmed everything the papers had already told me: the altered will, the hidden letters, the lost years. He said we needed you close, she said finally, her voice cracking under the weight of it. He said you'd be better off staying home, that going off to school would ruin you. He said the world out there didn't care about people like us. People like us. I didn't even know what that meant anymore. Was it about class, gender, family, or was it just code for broken people pretending they weren't? You mean he needed me close, I replied, my voice harder now, the emotion rising whether I wanted it to or not. Because I was useful, because keeping me down meant he could stay up, because he didn't want to lose control. She didn't argue. Instead, she turned off the tap, set the glass down carefully on the counter, and finally looked at me, really looked at me, as if for the first time she was seeing her daughter, not as the defiant child who had disappointed them, but as the adult woman who had quietly rebuilt herself out of the rubble they had left behind. I'm sorry, she said, and for a moment it almost felt like it mattered. But apologies don't erase years. They don't fix the missed opportunities, the jobs never applied for, the confidence eroded by a father's constant disapproval masked as discipline. That night, we all gathered again for dinner, not because anyone wanted to, but because the ritual was too ingrained to abandon, even when it had lost all meaning. The table was set, the food reheated, and the air so tense it could have snapped a bone. Greg finally emerged from his self-imposed exile, looking gaunt and tightly wound, like a man walking into a courtroom knowing the verdict had already been handed down. He sat at the head of the table as always, but this time, he didn't offer a toast. He didn't speak at all at first. He just stared at his plate, pushing green beans around with his fork like they were a puzzle he couldn't solve. I let the silence hang there, let the weight of it fill the room, until finally I leaned back in my chair and with calculated calm, turned to Kyle and said, "Did you know I paid off Dad's tax lien 3 years ago?" Quietly, behind the scenes. He never told you, did he? Kyle looked up confused. What? No, what are you talking about? Greg's head snapped up, his face tightening in that familiar way that signaled he was preparing for war, but wasn't sure which weapon to draw. I kept going. Yeah, the house almost got seized. I covered it, not because I wanted to, but because I was tired of watching him pretend he was holding everything together while blaming everyone else for the cracks. My mother gasped softly. Kyle looked from me to Greg like someone just realizing the rules of the game he thought he understood had changed mid-play. You think you're better than this family, Greg snapped finally, his voice rising, the rage he'd tried to suppress now boiling over. You think this house, this name, gives you the right to sit there and talk down to us like you're some kind of savior? I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at him with the calm detachment of someone who had already won. No, I don't think I'm better. I just think I'm free. The table shook as he slammed his fist down, the silverware rattling against the plates, the roast sliding half an inch across the serving dish. My mother jumped. Kyle stared, open-mouthed, the veil finally lifting from his eyes. And in that moment, I saw it. That crack in the mirror he had built around himself. The image of the patriarch, the provider, the man who had everything under control, it shattered. And I knew there was no putting it back together again. By the time the sun began to sink below the horizon on Christmas night, casting long blue shadows across the snow-covered lawn and painting the windows with the kind of muted melancholy reserved for endings that do not feel like conclusions, the house had grown quieter than I had ever heard it in all the years I'd lived there. Quieter even than the nights after my grandmother passed. Quieter than the tension-laced mornings when my father would sit in the kitchen reading the paper and waiting for a reason to explode. Quieter than the suffocating silence that used to settle over dinner whenever someone brought up a topic that threatened to crack the porcelain shell of our so-called family unity. It was a different kind of silence now, not one born of fear or habit or careful suppression, but something colder and heavier, as if the walls themselves were stunned, unsure how to stand in the wake of the truths that had finally been spoken aloud after a lifetime of avoidance. No one had tried to speak with me since the dinner, not my mother, who now floated through the rooms with the hollow expression of someone who had been forced to see her complicity under a harsh fluorescent light and found herself unable to look away. Not Kyle, whose usual carefree detachment had dissolved into a kind of stunned internal processing, the kind that made him avoid eye contact and mumble half-responses when spoken to, as though he was still figuring out whether to be angry at me or at the man he'd spent his whole life believing in. And certainly not Greg, who had returned to the upstairs bedroom immediately after his outburst, the loud stomp of his feet on the staircase the only noise he made, as though the sound itself could assert authority that no longer held weight. I spent that night in my old bedroom, which had long since been turned into a makeshift storage space, with boxes piled high against the walls and dusty blankets draped over furniture like forgotten ghosts. I didn't sleep much, not because I was anxious or afraid, but because the wheels in my mind wouldn't stop turning not with doubt, but with the sharp, unwavering rhythm of resolution. The revenge was done, but the consequence of it, what it had unearthed, what it had undone, what it had exposed in every person under that roof, was only beginning to unfold, and I couldn't help but wonder how long it would take before the reality of the situation set in for all of them in full. By morning, the snow had stopped, leaving behind a glistening, almost pristine blanket over the yard, deceptively beautiful in the way freshly fallen snow always is, soft, pure, silent, while underneath it lies the hard, frozen ground, unchanged and unforgiving. I made coffee in the same old chipped percolator that had been there since I was a child, standing in the kitchen barefoot on the cold tile, watching steam rise in delicate spirals from the mug as I considered what I was about to do. I hadn't come here just to announce the ownership. I had come to deliver finality, to put an end to the manipulations, to strip away the polite fiction that had allowed this family to operate like a crooked machine for decades. I waited until mid-morning, when Greg finally appeared, disheveled and visibly older, as if the truth had aged him overnight. His eyes were bloodshot, his mouth set in a tight line, but there was no fire left in him, no storm waiting to be unleashed, just a brittle kind of exhaustion, the kind that comes from losing something you had been convinced could never be taken from you. He didn't speak first, which was telling enough. So I did. I spoke with the attorney this morning, I said, calmly but firmly, setting a manila folder on the kitchen table between us like a dropped gauntlet. The house is officially registered under my name. The paperwork is processed. There's nothing left to contest. He didn't look at the folder, didn't move, just stood there, shoulders tight, jaw clenched, as though hearing it said aloud was more humiliating than anything he had imagined. "You'll have 30 days, I continued, not because I wanted to be cruel, but because I wanted to be clear. You, Mom, and Kyle. You'll need to make arrangements to move out." My mother, who had entered the kitchen mid-sentence, dropped the dish towel she'd been holding. She stared at me like I had just declared war, but there was no fury in her expression, only disbelief, betrayal, and the dawning realization that I meant it. "You're evicting us?" she asked, voice small, nearly a whisper. "No," I said slowly and precisely. "I'm reclaiming what was always mine, what should have been mine over a decade ago. And I'm choosing not to press charges for the forged will or the tax fraud because, believe it or not, I'm not interested in watching you both rot in court." Greg's face turned a shade paler, and I could see that flash of panic in his eyes, that instinctive recognition that he had crossed lines that could now be followed back to him with evidence, not just suspicion. But even in that moment, even stripped of every false shield he'd built for himself, he still couldn't admit guilt. "You're doing this just to humiliate us," he said, his voice low, but with that same sneering edge that had punctuated every argument we'd ever had. "No," I replied. I'm doing this so I can finally breathe without hearing your voice in my head telling me I'm not enough. I'm doing this so I can walk into a room and not shrink, because I've been conditioned to believe I take up too much space. I'm doing this because I'm tired of waiting for an apology that will never come, from people who never thought they had anything to be sorry for. They didn't respond. What could they say that wouldn't sound like begging or denial? Instead, my mother picked up the dish towel, folded it with trembling hands, and walked out of the room, her footsteps strangely hollow. Kyle stayed behind, lingering awkwardly in the doorway, his gaze flicking between me and the folder on the table. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to say something, anything, but whatever he might have conjured was swallowed by silence. "You could have told me," he muttered eventually. "I could have helped." I met his eyes. "Would you have believed me?" He didn't answer, and in that silence, I got all the answer I needed. By noon, I had packed up my things, though there wasn't much, just a suitcase, my coat, and the folder containing every legal document I would ever need. I stood on the porch for a long moment, looking back at the house, its faded siding and lopsided shutters, the icicles dangling from the gutters like tiny glass daggers, and I felt nothing. No nostalgia, no sadness, just the kind of clean, clear emptiness that comes when a wound has finally scarred over. And as I stepped off the porch and made my way to the car, the snow crunching beneath my boots, I allowed myself one final thought. Not for them, but for me. Did I go too far? Maybe. Was there another way this could have ended? Perhaps in a different version of this family, one where the truth mattered more than appearances, and love was offered without price. But that's not the family I was born into. Sometimes to heal, you have to tear it all down. Sometimes you don't wait for justice, you become it. And sometimes the quietest nights are the ones where the loudest reckonings begin.